Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's day 4 of CISO Forum Canada, and thank you for tuning in for the post-lunch session. My guests in this session are probably individuals that most people would club into a bit of a stereotype. These are C-suite executives who have perfected the process of making their life simple. They simply know how to say no. But as I said yesterday, CISOs, CTOs, CIOs are not individuals who live on just putting the no in innovation. They're individuals who, if I can quote Black Panther, get us to rethink our designs at all times. In Black Panther, you might remember the quote, "Just because something's working does not mean it cannot be improved. Just because we have a variety of smart communities initiatives across Ontario, across Canada, across the world, doesn't mean it cannot be improved." And today, from a security and a data governance perspective, we're going to be talking about what can we improve. To our audience, I will let you know that one of our guests today does have to leave at the 30-minute mark, so a couple of the questions will be targeted primarily at him to start off, but then we'll make sure to make it into a conversational engagement. Let's talk about data privacy, governance, in the perspective of a smart community. First, I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves very quickly, and I'll start off by beaming into the city of Toronto. Kush, can you introduce yourself and tell us what is it that the Office of the CISO does for the city of Toronto? Kush?
Thank you. My name is Kush Sharma. I'm the CISO for the city of Toronto. We have at the city of Toronto put cyber as a priority. We've taken cyber and created an independent division called the Office of the CISO. And we've consolidated a lot of the oversight and accountabilities of cyber across all 44 divisions into this new division. In addition, we're ramping up our teams, and we're primarily now responsible for all aspects of cyber, whether it's the core functions, digital trust, business resilience, forensics, and privacy operations. So we've brought all that together as one centralized function at the City of Toronto.
I think that aspect of how a municipality is taking the various elements of security and the various responsibilities and centralizing it is a topic which we may not necessarily get into in this discussion, but one that, if my advisors are listening to, is one that we can definitely look at as a separate topic. Kush, thank you for that introduction. From Toronto, I'm going to get on the 401 and travel all the way to Waterloo. And Mark Dillon, you're in no need of an introduction. Very quickly, your role, and what is it about data governance and smart communities that has you thinking?
Thanks, Ali. So I'm VP of IT for Waterloo Hydro, and I've been involved in some smart community activity for quite a while now, maybe about 10 years. One of the things that we've noticed is as we transition to making the citizen or the customer, empowering them to use their own data, there's a lot of challenges. Education, how we change our roles as the custodian of the data, and it's not always designed in a framework that thought that was where it was going to go. So you have hindrances sometimes, and I think these are some of the main challenges we have to deal with as we transform into intelligent communities.
And that aspect of design, everything has design, just not everything is designed in a good way, is something that we're definitely going to talk about. Because when we're talking about data, and you're talking about databases, a lot of it has to do with the design and the design frameworks that we take in order to guarantee some level of privacy. Thank you for bringing up that important point, Mark, as always, with a lovely introduction. I'm now going to go back on the 401 and head to my hometown, the city of Oshawa, and I'm going to have Steve introduce himself and tell us about one aspect of smart communities that the city of Oshawa is working on right now. Steve?
Hi, I'm Steve Patterson, Manager of Systems and Security Operations. So there's quite a number of smart initiatives that we're working on and aspects of smart initiatives that we're working on with some of our partners. So whereas there's the standard controls, lighting that many organizations are working on, we also have the advantage of having partners like Durham College, UOIT, working with us on other initiatives, as well as other private sector partners as well. Some of the things that we're starting to get into are not just solar, but actual dedicated power plants for facilities and tie-ins to those. So rather than just technology and individual data points, we're getting into the entire aspect of infrastructure and using data to actually help the community itself.
Thank you for bringing that aspect, because the aspect of partnerships and sharing between municipalities and academic bodies from a smart communities perspective is one that has a lot of privacy and compliance elements to it. So we'll definitely be touching base on that as well. The city of Oshawa is located in the region of Durham. We have 8 municipalities in our region, and all of our 8 municipalities, we work under the great leadership of one individual who's been championing a whole bunch of IT-based initiatives, specifically in smart communities in our region. KC, Kalyan Chakravarthy, I'll have you introduce yourself and talk to us about what keeps you excited with smart communities. KC.
Hi, my name is Kalyan Chakravarthy, or KC to be short, and I'm the CIO for region of Durham. And what keeps me excited about this smart city thing is like the difficult question to answer is, what are we doing? The most easiest question is, what are we not doing? Like, because we are saying that like we are doing everything that we can. And what Steve has talked about combining this collaborations into the post-secondary institutions. City Studio is one of the exciting initiatives that really excites me, because like that brings in Durham College, UIT, Trent, everybody together, and it is for tapping that next generation talent for solving the next generation problems. That is what City Studio is all about.
We plan for tomorrow by doing what we can today, and Casey has been an ambassador of that, working very closely with a variety of institutions in the region of Durham, and I want to thank him for that. And now I'm going to use the power, but I've already been using it, of the internet to cue into an individual who's become a good friend of mine from VMware Carbon Black. I am not entirely sure geographically where he's at right now, but I'm going to beam into him and have him introduce himself and talk to us about VMware's perspective on smart communities in a very short introduction. David, over to you.
Hi everybody, yeah, Dave Balcar here with VMware Carbon Black. I'm a security strategist here. So I kind of look at all the different things, whether it's smart cities and all the way down to your structured data. You know, I have all those kind of conversations around that, and VMware is kind of leading that right on the back end, because we provide all that infrastructure for a lot of cities around the world.
And as a global leader, I think one of the beauties of what we've seen with VMware Carbon Black is the ability to look at local environments and assist them with finding solutions that are tailored to their needs. If you've ever read this book by Thomas Friedman, there's a concept called glocalization. And I think when you read up about VMware Carbon Black and check out their group on cyberexchange.ca, you'll get to learn a lot about their customized perspectives on the different problems that are out there and the solutions that they posit. Let's jump right into the discussion. At Cyber Exchange 2.0 on August 14th, I delivered the opening keynote sponsored by Phelps Cybersecurity and Durham College's Center for Cybersecurity Innovation. As you know, I lead both the AI Hub as well as the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation. One of the aspects that I talked about as a problem with smart communities is that speed element. Everything had to have been done yesterday. And I want to go to Kush Sharma, because as multiple smart communities initiatives begin at the City of Toronto, Sidewalks Labs is a very good example. Often it's experienced that in busy urban metropolis, the CISO of those particular municipalities don't necessarily get consulted, because there's that competition to get everything out there connected quicker than ever before. Are you finding that in Toronto, that is one of the reasons why initiatives like Sidewalk Labs do not take off? Or are you seeing now that the CISOs are getting more consulted well in advance? Kush?
Yeah, thank you. I think for Sidewalk Labs, I think it was a multitude of factors, not just specifically privacy. So that's probably another discussion for another day. But in terms of the speed and in terms of the CISO being involved, I think because we're now an independent division, we report into the city manager directly. So in private sector, that would be the CEO, and administratively to the deputy city manager of corporate services. We are on the top of the agenda, right, for all key RFPs going out to the market. So we've made a conscious effort to build the relationships within IT and within the business, and all of those key initiatives now include us. So, you know, it was a ramp up period this year in 2020, but in 2021, all of the key initiatives that are over a certain threshold will have my office as part of the RFP team.
I think that's a very important point in terms of the engagement with your office, because as Kalyan said in his introduction, in the region of Durham, we have initiatives like Teaching Cities. In fact, Kalyan was responsible for leading the 2018 Smart Communities Conference here in Durham region. And Kalyan, I wanted to ask you, with more consultation and involvement from your office in all of the Smart Communities initiatives, are you finding that you're now having to make sure that access to information and requests are more clearly defined and made available to the citizens? And are you seeing citizens asking for more information before initiatives take place? Kalyan, your perspective.
I think there are a couple of things, there are a couple of aspects in the questions that you asked, Ali. Like, first portion is like, are we looking into access to information from a privacy perspective before the initiatives take place? And yes, that has been put into our process. There is a process in place where we are looking at it. And from a citizen's perspective, are they asking? I think most of the citizens are asking and they're trying to figure it out. And what we are doing it rather than a pull strategy that like citizens have to ask, we are using a push strategy to inform the people about what we are doing. Because like it is better to go to them upfront and tell them what we are doing so that the questions are asked at the start rather than after the things have been done and like use a FOI or any other kind of freedom of information request to really ask us like why you have not taken care of this. So ours is much more of a push strategy to really inform our residents. What is this particular initiative about? How is it going to affect you? And what are the processes that are in place to talk about equity, privacy, security, safety, or reliability, all these kind of factors, how are we making sure?
And as you mentioned, there are a lot of factors. And I know one of the questions that's already come in is on the aspect of all of these factors where we can speak about them, but on the financial books, they add up to a cost. And this is where I want to bring in Steve. We'll go to Mark, and then we'll go to David, and then back to the city of Toronto. Steve, with all these requests, with all of these different initiatives, I'm part of a couple of them here in the city of Oshawa, where the Durham College campus is located. When we're doing all of these initiatives and generating all of this data, let's say traffic data, transit data, garbage collection data, there's a need for more transparency. There's a need to share more and prepare more dashboards and visualize what we're seeing happening on these devices. Is that adding a strain on the security resources at the city? Steve?
Security-wise, not so much. Because of products that are offered by Microsoft, there's far more ability to actually publish this data and publish it securely. The other thing that we do is, rather than looking at security as strictly as an IT thing, cybersecurity is actually a corporate initiative with IT providing technical guidance and recommendations along with some oversight, as opposed to actually saying, we own cyber. So corporately, the organization has recognized that security is a responsibility for everyone in the organization, whether it's just someone working with the public and at a front desk at a rec center, straight through to our C-levels and our corporate leadership team. So from that perspective, it's not really an additional load on us. Where we actually find that there's more load is with our corporate clerks group, where they're having to actually ensure that people understand what data is private, what data is protected, as opposed to data that may be freely shared with the public, and ensuring that we don't have personal information going out onto the street without people being aware and actually providing the approvals that are required.
Thank you for that point, because you bring forward a very interesting philosophical standpoint for us to take off from and go back to Mark Dillon. They always say, right, that the minute somebody puts up a wall or the minute somebody takes up a stance, there's always another person that wants to see what's on the other side or what's beyond that particular stance. And Mark, when you're doing a lot of smart communities initiatives at Waterloo Hydro and in the different municipalities that you've worked in, a lot of times you now see a lot of other parties that want access to that information to run their products. I've said this a lot, that Starbucks is a technology company that happens to sell coffee, and you've been a proponent of that as well. How do you deal with all of the requests that you're getting, and how do you make sure that you're sharing for good in a secure fashion? Mark.
So the truth is, I think we're still, and I mean the whole industry is still in a place where we're too immature to have a good answer to that question, but it is a real problem. And I think there's two major compromises that we're at risk of making right now. And the first is, we don't have a bunch of money for this stuff, but everybody wants it. And they want it, like you said, yesterday. So what tends to happen is the many types of different pilots that may happen. And there's two problems that could crop up during those pilots. The first is that it's funded by an external partner that has an vested interest in the future of this thing being an operational revenue stream for them. And that might mean we might go too proprietary with some new technology, which then might bar some of the access that you just mentioned that some other third parties might want and should have, especially if they're public assets. The second problem is that sometimes there's a mentality going in that because this is a minimum viable product pilot, it doesn't actually need to work well. We just need to see where it goes and get it done. But all too often that ends up being the production version of it because time crunch, cost crunch, etc. So I think, I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but what I'm saying is I think there's a risk that we're heading in a direction where it won't be possible to share or to share well. And the right way to do that is to think it through and come up with a strategy, like many municipalities and many companies have started to do, to say, what does this look like in 5 years, and what should we do next month and next year because of that, rather than a large company came to me and said, I want to do this, I'll fund 80% of it, and here are the rules. And that's maybe what some of the concerns around Cyber Labs were and why that may have gone the way it went. But yeah, so I don't know that we're in a state where we're sharing as well as we could, because like Casey said, we don't know what we're doing yet, right? We know what we're not doing.
Mark, I really like the perspective that you brought, and if I can just stay on the vein of Black Panther, there was a line in Black Panther where they said, our fear of discovery is what prevents us from doing what's right. And that's a perfect segue to bring in David from VMware Carbon Black, because VMware Carbon Black has particular tools that help you to see what's going on some of these IoT devices and take action from there. David, can you take a few moments to talk to us about that, and then we'll go back to Kush and take his leave as he has to go to another meeting. So David, talk to us a little bit about the tools that are available through VMware Carbon Black.
Sure. I mean, some of the main tools that we have, we're the specialist in EDR, endpoint detection and response, and I brought up the other day, the biggest thing is visibility. You've got to have that visibility into it, and that's one big thing with a lot of smart city technologies, whether it's electronic gas meters or any the RFID stuff on light meters and stuff, or sidewalks. There's all kinds of stuff, but the problem is they're getting implemented without security technologies, usually from the forefront. They are getting rapidly installed because people want the data. Then it's who is actually coming in there and saying, hey, what are we going to do with this data? That's that public privacy thing. I don't think my neighbors need to know how much I pay for electricity versus somebody else, but from that tool perspective, that's where the VMware Carbon Black family really can bring in that expertise and tools to get that visibility so you can put security around this stuff.
And I really want to dive into those differences between security and privacy. If you go onto cyberexchange.ca and on demand, there are a couple of talks given by Kat Kood, Debbie Reynolds, and a couple of other experts on that fine line between what we call secure and what we call private. And certainly as we go further in this discussion, we'll talk a little bit about that. I know we've got a bit of time, but we have 6 more minutes with Kush Sharma, the CISO at the City of Toronto, and I want to bring a question to him that's come in from our audience, and that is on the aspect of how do you maintain audit and audit legitimacy in such a fast-paced moving environment. With smart communities, you're gathering terabytes and terabytes of data, sometimes on a daily basis. Multiple institutions, multiple bodies feeding into the operations within the city. How can audits be timely, but also how can audits be seen as being legitimate and useful? Kush.
Thank you for that question. I think the amount of data that we're generating a day is in the terabytes and maybe even higher. So we do have to grapple with this issue, and then parsing the data of what's PII and health data, right, for us versus any kind of public or internal data that can be shared. So it's a challenge that we look at every day. I think for us, what we're trying to do is work with the team members, work with the clerk's office, work with the vendors to try to come up with solutions in terms of the retention of the data and the type of data that we need to actually store. So, if you look at some of the schedules that we have, they might be outdated. So it might say store all data for 3 years. Well, we have to deep dive into the regulation, into the schedules, into the clerk's office. We may have to call the privacy commissioners and have a discussion to say, well, are we looking at all of the metadata, or just, for security would be the log data, the alert data? Do we really need to save all of the metadata also? And so if we go down to the metadata level, then it's extremely expensive, extremely time consuming, and administrative. But if we can, and what we try to do is negotiate, we try to work with all of these different stakeholders depending on the project to see what is feasible, and how long the data based on risk needs to really be stored and archived versus data that can be deleted after a month, a year, etc. And so that helps with privacy also, if we don't have to retain all of that PII and health data for extended periods of time.
I think we lost Ali's
Yeah.
audio feed.
Yep.
Ali, we can't hear you, Ali.
And I'm sure now you can hear me. I was on
There
mute.
we go.
And
There you
that's
go.
the line of 2020 that you're on mute. I was just saying, Kush, I really do appreciate the fact that you took the time to join us today. I know you have to head into another meeting, so we will wish you a happy rest of the day, and thank you once again for your time, and we'll jump into the remainder of the discussion. Kush, thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.
Cheers. Kush brought up a whole bunch of acronyms around how we share that data. He used terms like PIs, he used terms like researchers, RAs, so on and so forth. If you do a little bit of research on how smart communities operate and how sharing of data occurs, academic institutions play a fundamental role in that. I've said this a lot of times. If you're going to discuss opinions, we'll go with mine. If we're going to go with data, then we'll have a discussion. Data brings people together, which lends an important question of how do municipalities ensure data integrity when they're working with a college or university? Kalyan, we'll start off with you, then go to Steve, Mark, and then back to David. In Teaching City, for example, how are you ensuring that the students that are engaging in data, let's say traffic data, are doing it in the ways that they're supposed to be? Casey.
I think the first thing comes up is like where when you're working with any of our partners, we look at the data sharing agreement. Like when we move any data from our premises or like giving access to anybody, we talk about a data sharing agreement. And the data sharing agreements we talk about like depends on like covers a couple of things. First is what is the subject matter? Like what are they using it for what purpose that is being done for? What is the duration that they are looking for to use this data? And the type of personal data, because people think that like personal data, once we say personal data, they put it under the same umbrella. But like different personal data has a different kind of a retention, different kind of a security part. Then the nature and purpose, like what are they trying to do, and like what is it that they are going to derive? Because we also look at like not only the raw data, but like we need to talk about the equity and fairness of how it is being used. That's what like we are responsible for us. And then what are the obligations that they are going to maintain, both from our side and as well as them. So these are the key things that we'll look at it to see how they are using the data, what they are using it for, and what kind of data that they're using. So that like we exactly know that like when we are sharing the data or when we are providing the access to the data, we have an understanding of the end result as well as the process.
An understanding of the end result, and thank you again, Casey, for making a really easy path to go into the next sort of frame of discussion and bring Steve back into the conversation. Steve, at the city of Oshawa, for example, numerous initiatives are taking place from a transit perspective, garbage pickup, so on and so forth. Are you finding it now that it's on your responsibility now to make sure that citizens are educated about best practices with data? And if so, what kind of awareness programs are you running? Steve.
It's not something that we're finding that we're having to educate the public on so much. One of the things that we find really is more and more of the public are educating themselves. Where we find there are the biggest gaps in at least our municipality is in some of the specific demographic groups where We do have people that are unfamiliar with technology or haven't had to learn a significant amount of technology. Where we find, once again, our partners are playing a big role in that is groups like the Oshawa Senior Citizen Center and the Oshawa Public Libraries are doing quite a bit to help educate specific demographics in overall cyber computer awareness and technology, data, and how data can actually be used. Where one thing that we really need to remember is the purpose of a municipality is to provide services and to use data to provide services to the community. There's a lot that we can do, but we don't really we don't have the funding, and ultimately it's not best for a municipality to be trying to educate people in certain areas because that's not what we're set up to do, whereas other organizations like educational institutes, like community groups, are far better able to provide that education effectively and cost effectively without further burdening the citizens.
Thank you for that. And again, you've given me quite a lot to work with and ingredients to tie in a question that has also come in. And Mark, I'll bring you in and then we'll go to David. And Mark, this is this concept of, as your CISOs, yourselves, CIOs, CTOs, there's this hope of omnipotence that we're watching everything, but we're missing out on certain things. And the question that's come up here is about the example in a particular mall in Canada where a particular facial recognition technology was being used without the consent of the patrons of that particular mall. How do you set up a process wherein if certain IoT-based devices, if data beacons, etc., are being used, that there is due process followed and that the security teams are given enough heads up to validate a particular solution and data capture mechanism? Mark.
So there's a lot to unpack in there. One of the things that David said earlier is, he doesn't need his neighbors knowing how much power he uses. And the data is becoming a double-edged sword because it provides value in decision-making information, right? Large aggregate data, and you never know exactly which pieces you're going to need, so businesses tend to hold on to it, even if they're not sure exactly how they want to use it. But the double-edged sword part is data you don't have is data that can't be stolen. And most of the time, that information isn't really yours, it's someone else's, and you're holding it for them because at one time you had a file clerk that had a bunch of paper stuff, and they were essentially in between the customer and the information as a collation system, as a retrieval system. We don't need that anymore for the same purpose, but we're still collecting the data. And so the thing you mentioned was, how do you make sure that something like that doesn't go wrong, that someone doesn't feel taken advantage of, or that they had information collected about them that they didn't consent to? And how do we make sure our security teams know about this ahead of time? And that somewhat ties back to the pilot notion I was talking about before. Often you'll find that a business or a public institution will bring something in as sort of, let's see if it works. And they may not even talk to their technology group as they're doing that because they're in such a hurry. The technology group's got 3 years of project backlog, and we don't need them right now. And so there's a real risk there that'll happen, especially when you have a decentralized ownership. You've got 5 or 6 groups that are looking after certain things, and you've got unclear responsibilities. One of the things I always talk about is phone system, door systems, camera systems. Who owns them? Nobody knows why until they break. And those systems, one of which you just mentioned, tend to have a collection rate of data that you might typically think of as not IT. And so we can call it OT now that it has an IP address, and we used to just call it, facilities. So we need to really consider, what are we collecting, where are we storing it, and why? And something that Kush mentioned earlier is, and for how long, based on the risk. And so I think we need to seriously consider, especially as our storage costs are so low, why would you delete it? And the reason is, it's not yours and you may not need it. There's some line here where we're probably not doing a good enough job in running the math on that. It looks like you're muted again.
I think you've raised a very important aspect on how we work with the information that we get about different practices around IoT. I've said this a lot of times, right? We often listen to reply, don't listen to understand, but there needs to be a time continuum there. So thank you, Mark, for emphasizing the importance of relations and sharing. David, one of the questions that's come in is peculiar to not necessarily a particular tool, but I'm going to imagine that it's related to a particular practice within VMware Carbon Black. And that is, while you are protecting my network or while you are constantly surveilling my network for different threats, so on and so forth, what kind of alarms and controls are in place to warn me of an activity where data could be compromised? Can you talk to us about that through the VMware Carbon Black stack? David?
Yeah, as far as that stack, it's going to be from both sides, right? The network side and from the endpoint itself. You're going to be looking at that data throughput coming back out, and also have the ability to look at the who, what, when, where, right? Who was accessing the data? What were they doing? What process? Could be a piece of malware, could be a legitimate process that's accessing data, and be able to go back. Because a lot of times you might have open systems where, oh, okay, yeah, anybody can get to that data, but if something does happen to that data, can we come back and take a look at it and do something with it? Just like ransomware, right? If ransomware hits your system, guess what it's going to do? It's going to wipe out all the data and try to encrypt it. And that brings me back to another point that, like what Mark was saying, is, how long do we need to keep this data? Why do we need to keep this data? How do we protect this data? I've seen plenty of data breaches happen because companies held on to data way too long. They didn't need it. It wasn't valuable to them, but to the attacker, it's very valuable. So I consider that in the supply chain attacks, where I'm trying to attack a customer of Mark from a municipality perspective. So I go after him versus the real target, because he's already got the data and it's open and free and it's easy to get to.
Open, free, and easy to get to. About, I would say 3 months ago, I was on another panel with KC from the region of Durham, and we started talking about how municipalities, through rolling out smart communities, are now developing almost a sense of an e-citizen, where the citizen now lives, or the citizen of a particular municipality now has a particular digital identity that the city has a lot of access into and a lot of control into. Kalyan, can you talk to us a little bit about what your perspectives are on this whole e-government and e-citizen concept and where that could take smart communities to? Casey.
I think when you look at it, I would like to add one statement that what you said, we don't have control over it. We have a lot of access over the part of the resident. And what is happening is where, as Marcus said, data is becoming a double-edged sword. So we can use it. I'll talk about the positive side of it, when we have a digital identity that is being created for a resident. Once you create a digital identity, that really helps the municipalities, as well as any government, any level of government, to really access that identity and provide the kind of services that they need in a pure digital fashion. Because it is a cyclical thing where you cannot provide a complete end-to-end digital service unless you have a digital identity. And what it also does is once you have that digital identity, it really shapes the smart cities in a completely different way, where you have that connection, you have that two-way communication that is happening between the resident and the government. So anything that you do, you can monitor to see what is the utilization. And because the biggest thing that we need to look at in the smart city or a smart community or an intelligent community, however we talk about it, is the not just whether we have rolled out some service or not, but whether it is being used effectively or efficiently. So that is what we can get. That is what the measurement of the effectiveness will change once you have the digital identity. So that will create that loop of getting the feedback from the customer and then improving the services to really say, how can I fine tune it?
As all of you would know, I'm a big fan of existentialist philosophy, and when I was having a session on identity access management with Bill Harmer from Secure Auth, one of the things that we said that back in the days it was I think, therefore I am. Today it's I'm connected, therefore I always am. And I want you to chew on that a little bit. That's another statement for a t-shirt that those watching CISO Forum Canada can certainly take and print on. We've got another 10 to 12 minutes left, and there are quite a few questions that are rolling in. Steve, I want to start off with you, go back to Mark, and follow the same order that we've been following. It's working pretty well. Steve, and this is the aspect of validation. Is it fair to assume, or is it fair to recommend that each city that's going down, or each community, as I prefer to say, that's going down the path of engaging in some form of smart community initiatives, should have its own set of standards and its own validation process in order for a public-based smart community process to take place. Your thoughts on that, Steve?
Well, certainly validation and standards are something that are absolutely essential if you're going to have any kind of success in any kind of digital initiative, or really any kind of initiative at all. Going back to the premise of, you can't manage what you can't measure. What are you going to measure unless you have a set of actual guides and a set of standards to use to actually provide that overall framework? Now, that being said, it doesn't necessarily make sense for every community to have their own. More and more organizations are starting to work together to define more universal standards and more universal governance methods for actually measuring data, collecting data, determining how it should be stored, when it should be stored, and how it can be used. Now, the more cooperation there is between organizations, the faster it is for things to actually get off the ground, but also the faster it is for data and similar initiatives to be used elsewhere. If I develop a set of standards, well, does it really make sense for then Toronto or Durham or Whitby or Ajax or Niagara or someplace in the US or the UK to then go ahead and develop their own set of standards from scratch and reinvent the wheel? Whereas it may make more sense to take my standards, make whatever changes are appropriate to be effective in their area and what their use case is. Likewise, once standards are developed, organizations that are actually trying to use data or trying to put systems in place to collect data are ground running far more effectively because they already know what to expect and what hurdles and what kinds of restrictions and limitations they're likely to run into up front.
Another question that's come in, and it sort of works with what Steve said, but kind of also works a little bit on what KC said earlier on, and I'll bring it to the plate with Mark. And this is on this aspect of control, or to some degree, a level of assurance of we can switch something off. We have the kill switch. As you have pushes towards 5G networks, as more and more devices are connecting through public IPs and running across the public internet, is it really fair to assume that security staff can do much about the proliferation of IoTs and the sharing of data? Are we at a position right now, to quote the question directly, where really it's just a best effort and everything else, we leave it to how the users use those devices at the end of the day? Mark.
So this is another philosophy question, and it goes back to the first thing: is what's the internet for, right? Is it a pathway for communication, or is it a product that also has safety built in? And I think it's going to depend on what data you're talking about. If it's an individual with their own data, like if I can get an MRI and I get a hold of the digital copies, I can upload it on Facebook. That's my MRI. If someone else did that, that's a horrendous crime, and it should be. But the issue becomes how simple it is for the data to be proliferated, how impossible it is to remove it once it's out there, far more than would have been. And I know I've mentioned it before, but Edward Snowden's book that covers this permanent record, the idea that, when I was growing up, my first tooth that I lost or the first step I took might have been recorded in some faded analog method that's probably gone now. But today, it's on the internet and probably forever somewhere. And if it gets deleted, don't worry, you can get it at archive.org, or it's in someone's cache, or it's shared somewhere else. So I do think that that's maybe an education piece, but I don't think people don't get that part yet. So I think you're right that our effort is going to be to make sure that we are good custodians of the data that we have, and the owners can do what they want with it. So, and if we happen to be the owner because it's our data and we created it, then we need to figure out what it is that we're going to do with it and how we're going to share it. And I wanted to speak to something that Steve said, which was the idea of not individual frameworks across the many places. So I happen to be a citizen of Canada that just happens to live in the province of Ontario and the region of Waterloo and the city of Waterloo. The interoperability, they all have data on me and they all need to talk to me, and sometimes about the same thing. And we've currently got a siloed lack of interoperability system where they all have individual records that all have different levels of integrity based on the last time I talked to them. It would be a shame if we digitized that.
On this aspect of it would be a shame to digitize that. Let's work a little bit now with understanding these frameworks. I think you've raised a very important aspect about data sovereignty and data governance has a lot to do with nation state building. David, this question again from our audience, and that has to do with the different frameworks that you have to make sure that your clients are compliant to. There are different frameworks in North America, different ones in the European Union. How do you adjust for the different jurisdictions and the different policies around securing and keeping data private? David.
It is getting extremely difficult because you have, whether it's Starbucks or PCI or GDPR or whatever happens to come out of the state of California, they don't seem to talk to each other. They all want to do their own little thing, and it is difficult. And in my world, I consider it as another threat actor, because not only do my day job, right? I have to maintain the data. I have to make sure it's secure. But then I've got these regulations and all these frameworks and everything else that my C-suite wants me to conform to. It's like, man, I'm getting hit by two different directions, and it is very, very difficult out there. And if you don't know what you have and why you have it and what you want to do with it, that's a key thing, right? Because if the regulators come in and say, well, we're going to fine you, $10 million because you kept this data too long, or your data got leaked out because some laptop got left in a car and got stolen. That's the thing, right? That's the who, what, when, where. If I don't keep that data encrypted at rest, if I don't keep it even encrypted in transit, why am I keeping that data? Why am I keeping it that long? That goes a lot to not just fulfilling. I mean, a lot of those frameworks, that's what they're saying, right? It says, okay, only keep it for 6 years, only keep it for 2 years. This is considered PII. This is not considered PII. And that definition changes between, even here in the States, here when I deal with customers in the UK, their definition of PII is a little bit different than what we have here. And it is a big, big struggle. And we're back on mute.
I keep making that mistake of toggling between the two. I do apologize. Speaking on that aspect of the struggle, at the Internet of Things World Forum, I believe this was in 2018, a stat was released that said, 67% of the IoT devices out there are still believed to be in production. And in some cases, companies, and a good volume of them suggested that only 20% of companies engaging in IoT felt that they had hit any metrics of success. Casey, you've been part of some of these movements around open data and sharing more data so that companies can test different technologies and test different tools. How has that process been like, and what kind of results have you started to see? What kind of benefits have you started to see from sharing certain data sets the way that you have?
I think I would say that we're still in the learning mode, because first we looked at and thought about the volume of data, and we said the more the number of data sets, the effective way of we are doing our job effectively. Then quickly we realized saying that it is not about the quantity of data, it's about the quality and the usefulness of the data. Okay. And what we are figuring it out is we changed our metrics on how we look at our effectiveness to say, how many people are really using it and what are people wanting it? So once again, this is where gets back to that digital identity, having that two-way communication to really get the feedback to say, what is the kind of data that people are looking at? Because when you see in the open government, open data, it is not just about municipality, it is and all forms of government where they are putting a lot of information out there, but how many people are really using it? There is a very limited set of data that is really useful. You might have terabytes and terabytes of data, but what is really useful and who are using it? That is where we are looking at and saying that we are reaching out to people to say, what exactly do you want? And most of the use cases are coming from, and which is not surprising, are coming from the educational institutions. Yeah. It is that majority of it is coming from there, which can pull into the research. So that is where whether it's a city studio or any partnership that we are looking at to really say, what kind of data are you looking at so that we can get that data and put it, rather than just putting loads and loads of data into it.
And I think speaking on that aspect of having loads and loads of data, as we call the data ocean, you're looking for that drop of usefulness. So you're trying to take an entire ocean, fill it into a little glass, which makes it very, very challenging. On that very same vein, Mark, there's a question that's come in, which I'll reword just a little bit, but I think it plays well to you, and then we'll go back to Steve. And this is on this aspect of how do we even trust some of the data points that we're receiving from our own sanctioned IoT? For example, if we're using a device to track usage of a particular road, or we're using a device to track how people may be using a particular facility, how can we make sure that there's data integrity and that decisions are being made on data sets that are validated and that have been obtained through secure mechanisms? Mark.
That's a great question. I was thinking about exactly that while Casey was talking. And it comes down to, I forget where I heard this, but I didn't make it up. You can't put garbage in the lake and expect to catch fish. So we need to change the way that we collect our data. And you might remember there was a stunt someone pulled where they got maybe 150 cell phones and walked around with a wagon, and Google thought there were traffic jams everywhere. And we all knew that that was possible, but then someone did it, and then everyone thought, wow, why is that? Why is that okay? Is Google not secure? What's happening here? And Google wasn't hacked. They were just making an assumption based on inferences of where cell phones were and how they were moving, and it was the most elegant, inexpensive way they could possibly think to accomplish this flow of traffic. And we make some of those same mistakes. So one of the things an industry like mine might talk about is the idea of publishing our infrastructure data. And maybe, you know, a fancy GIS company like Esri or someone else would say, I'm going to give you a Quest headset, and you're going to have nice AR, you're going to look at the ground, and you're going to see where the stuff is under the ground. The problem is the way we've collected the data in the past is, yeah, we know what street it's on, we'll send someone out and find it. That level of accuracy was acceptable with our previous practices. The things we want to do in the future, that's not good enough. So we can't even start talking about that cool end goal. We need to go back to the very beginning and make sure that we groom our data to be useful enough. Because like what Casey said, there's tons of stuff out there and no one cares. It's a bunch of CSV files that is basically a bunch of inaccurate data that's good enough for business the way we do it today, but not good enough to be open and public and useful to someone who isn't us.
Absolutely, and I think this aspect that you've mentioned about how can we make it useful goes back to a power hour that's on the Cyber Exchange between myself and Danny Pahar, where we discussed about the value of what it is that we bring with the different initiatives that we propose within our communities and the security frameworks that they come with. Steve, COVID-19, obviously we have another 6 to 7 minutes to go, has kind of accelerated the need to share data from a geospatial perspective, from a personal perspective as well, simply because of the contact tracing elements as well. How has the city dealt with some of these aspects which require you to share data, especially around traffic of citizens in different spaces? Steve? It wasn't just me, Steve did it as well. Steve, you're on mute.
Awesome.
You're a trendsetter, Ali.
You just need to do it 2 more times.
So from a city perspective, there's not a lot of that data that the city collects and shares. That almost would have been a better question for Casey, really. Where our obligation is monitoring the flow of our own employees and where they are in buildings, where they are in facilities, whether they're working from home, and their health and safety. Where we have the citizens, where we have to deal with is visitors into our facilities. So for instance, much like if you're going to a restaurant, you have to sign in so that people are aware that, okay, we're there. So if there is a trace issue, we have to do that with all of our recreation centers, with all of our public buildings. So if someone wants to come in and deal with a tax issue, for instance, they have to actually go through a screening process at City Hall. We have to maintain that information. But likewise, we have to make sure that that information is kept private until such time as it's actually used to ensure that public safety is maintained. So that's where we're getting into a lot of the issues with maintaining privacy and personal information that normally we wouldn't collect, and certainly we wouldn't collect in this volume.
Speaking about volume and the way in which we collect data. So thank you, Steve, for that perspective and showing the difference between what different municipalities and how structures work. Because I think that in and of itself and the governance structures that you've pointed to really speak to how we handle our data and the privacy rules around them. Casey, I do want to come to you about this question around digital inputs of how to collect data. people often think, you know what, and I don't disagree with it. Hey, books don't need batteries. Sometimes pen and paper does the trick and gets what we need done. But can you comment a little bit about how, when we think about data privacy, when we think about data security, physical security also needs to factor in? One example is, hey, if you're working at home with the window open, someone could take a picture of that screen. Can you comment a little bit about, especially for our listeners, how physical security also impacts our data security?
I think it's a very complicated topic. You can go either way on it to say whether it, because right now, especially with most of our employees working remotely, and like a lot of employees working from remotely, how would you define that security, the physical security? Because earlier it was very easy. If you can't reach there, you can't see there. That's the simplistic part of it. But like now when it is going in, that is where, like, coming back to the whole thing of that identity management becomes a very, very important thing. It's not about where you are, but it is about who you are. Like, how do I know that, like, I can make sure that, like, if you are the person, then wherever you are, like, you might be in Oshawa sitting and remotely working in, or like somewhere else, but like you have to access that data, and like you have the right to access that data or the permissions to access that data. So you should be able to access it. So that's why it is more about not the physical part as much as it is, but like it is about like making it sure on the identity basis. So that is one thing the thought process has changed during the COVID, to really say that earlier we were much more on the physical space to say, okay, I will secure who will enter my space. And then once you are here, like, I can trust you. And then like, I will make sure that like, I'll give access to it. But like now it is not about, like, it can be anywhere. So I need to verify who you are digitally. And once I know that like you are this identity, you should have access to it. So that is how I feel. But like, I think the pendulum is shifting this way, but there are still that point of where we are still looking at it from the older way to say, okay, if you are there, you can see it. If you are not there, you can't see it. There are still some regulations. There are still some protocols that we are putting in. There are some access where people can't see the data if you are accessing it remotely.
I think that's so eloquently put, because this aspect of trust certificates, and I speak about this quite a bit, trust certificates are not something that just evolved from our digital lives. They've been with us for a very long time. Our social identities depend on those trust certificates. And David, this is a perfect landing spot to sort of give some closing comments to VMware Carbon Black before we wrap up. And this is on the aspect of trust. With smart communities, with this acceleration of how much we know, in some cases, you know, folks talk about certain IoTs being able to capture close to 1,000 to 2,000 data points about one particular individual. Silence is a data point as well. But there is a lot of movement around the right to be forgotten. There is a lot of movement around how do we know the limits of surveillance, so on and so forth. From a VMware Carbon Black perspective, how do you assure the end users, how do you ensure that the tracing, the monitoring that you're doing is A, rendering useful results, but B, keeping in mind that there are privacy issues that have to be respected as well? David?
Yeah, I would, talk back to what Casey was saying earlier. You got to verify and get that trust level, right? And from a VMware perspective, we have this whole model of intrinsic security, bringing it all together. So tools like Workspace ONE, stuff like that, so you can get that identity. Doesn't matter what device. So our vision is, your data on any device, on any cloud, any infrastructure. Doesn't matter where you are, which plays into what we're going on right now. It just, companies were taking 10 years to get there. Now they had 10 days to get there. From the privacy perspective also, that's really, you need to know. So if someone comes back in and says, okay, well, 10 days ago, I found my data on Facebook. Well, how did it get there? Well, someone's got to be able to tell you that. And that's kind of scary, because you need to be able to go after that. So like Casey was saying, there's that some data we can't allow outside the organization. I work with government organizations, the same thing. If you're not physically in the building, you cannot get to the data, whether you have access to it or not. But sometimes those rules have to be bent. I know plenty of customers right now that have had to bend those rules to keep themselves in business, keep the data flowing, keep the lights on, all of that good stuff. it is a very slippery slope, to say the least. There was a case just recently, about 3-4 weeks ago, where a clerk was dealing with medical records, and she could not print. They had it all locked down, couldn't do anything like that. All she did was take the cell phone and start taking pictures of the screen and started selling that information. So that kind of stuff you just can't prevent. There's always a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. And there are at least 4 more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. As I said yesterday, you know what, the clock resets at the end of each day, and each day is going to bring up new discussions around data privacy and security. But if I can take 30 seconds just to sum up what our brilliant panelists have brought to you today. Let's start off with Steve, where Steve talked about this aspects of governance and jurisdictions, municipalities that sit within broader institutions, or that sit within a larger cluster of different municipalities, knowing what data sets they have access to, what their responsibilities are, and communicating that with folks such as KC, who manage infrastructure for a bunch of municipalities as a whole. Understanding not just that, but understanding the mechanisms through which citizens are informed about what's happening with their data, be it through the open data movements, be it through different visualizations and tabulations that can be provided to the end user. It's extremely important to keep those elements in mind. And I think for security practitioners, one of the most important things that you've learned today is this aspect around the communications well in advance around what's happening with different smart communities initiatives and how those are going to be used. You do not want to be outsmarted by our movements towards smart communities. And then with Mark, he's raised very important questions about our frameworks in Canada. And insofar as we can monetize data at all times and make money out of it, if that's the equation that we take, then unfortunately, we've understood the price of everything but the value of nothing. I thank you all for giving us socioeconomic, technical perspectives on the importance of data governance and privacy in the context of cybersecurity, and importantly to our friends at VMware Carbon Black, thank you for constantly relating our thoughts to the toolset that you have, but more importantly, to the people and the process that you've perfected at VMware Carbon Black. I want to thank VMware Carbon Black for sponsoring this along with the city of Oshawa and continuing to support cybersecurity discussions across Canada. We are in a time of crisis, we are in a time of challenge. There's one thing that I've always said, that in time of crisis, foolish people will build barriers, intelligent people will build bridges. Thank you for building bridges to your community and your citizens. I'll ask you to stay on in the green room so we can have a quick 30-second debrief, and I want to thank our audience, and I hope you enjoy your next session, which is going to start in the next 25 minutes. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy.